Right. Well, tonight for Creekside Book by Book, we are going to be in Deuteronomy 12 through 14. And this is a chunk of scripture that is going to be focusing in on the right worship of Yahweh. And so as we have been walking through Deuteronomy, it follows a kind of a covenant framework where the Lord is the greater party and the nation of Israel is the lesser party. So there's like a king and the subjects of the king. And so this is a renewal document for the covenant, Moses' last sermon for the people. And as part of the covenant, there are stipulations on how to honor the Lord or honor the greater party. And so here the Lord is giving through Moses the instructions on how to honor him as he is the divine ruler of the nation. And so there's going to be some things that we have gone over in the past with different elements of the law. So I'm not necessarily going to dive as deeply into some things, but there's still a lot of, there's some interesting things in this section. So let's just jump in. Chapter 12, verse 1. These are the decrees and laws you must be careful to follow in the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you to possess. As long as you live in the land, destroy completely all the places on the high mountains, on the hills, and under every spreading tree, where the nations you are dispossessing worship their gods. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, and burn their Asherah poles in the fire. Cut down the idols of their gods and wipe out their names from those places. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, but you are to seek the place the Lord your God will choose from among all your tribes to put his name there for his dwelling. To that place you must go. There bring your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your tithes and special gifts that you have vowed to give, and your freewill offering and the firstborn of your herds and flocks. There in the presence of the Lord your God, you and your families shall eat and shall rejoice in everything you have put your hand to, because the Lord your God has blessed you. You are not to do as we do here today, everyone doing as they see fit, since you have not yet reached the resting place and the inheritance the Lord your God is giving you. But you will cross the Jordan and settle in the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, and he will give you rest from all your enemies around you so that you will live in safety. Then to the place the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name, there you are to bring everything I command you, your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your tithes and special gifts, and all the choice possessions you have vowed to the Lord. And there rejoice before the Lord your God, you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levites from your towns who have no allotment or inheritance of their own. Be careful not to sacrifice your burnt offerings anywhere you please. Offer them only at the place the Lord your Lord will choose in one of your tribes, and there observe everything I command you. All right, so as we are focusing in on worship, the Lord is saying there are going to be these other nations that are worshiping the Lord in all kinds of different manners, and there's going to be high places and shrines and different totems and asherahs and all these poles and all these idols. And the first thing the Lord says is you have to remove those things from the land and completely wipe them out, and don't fall into the same kinds of worship practices, because those are things that are abhorrent to the Lord. And so when the Lord is desiring a purity for the people of Israel in how they worship. And so any kind of syncretism, mixing of different practices, any tie to pagan worship systems, the Lord is removing those. And as one of the ways to help eliminate the temptation for those different ways to practice, the Lord is highlighting, like, there will be one central place where they will gather together to make their offerings and observe sacrifices and all that sort of thing. So they don't have it yet, and the text doesn't tell us where it's going to be yet, but eventually it will be Jerusalem, and on Mount Zion, that's where they will build the temple. And so the tabernacle, if you remember, has as they've been traveling through the wilderness, has served the function of being that that central location for the people. And it was set up in the middle of the camp so that everybody could have access, and it was in the dwelling place of the Lord's name right there in the middle of everybody. But as they spread out throughout the land, they're going to need to have someplace other than the tabernacle. And so the tabernacle will be in Shiloh for a while, and it'll move around, but it's ultimately going to end up in Jerusalem. And one of the key elements here, when we think about all these false shrines, is people could worship anywhere. And so the Lord is saying, no, you can't do that. You can't worship just anywhere in the covenant with the people of Israel. You have to come to Jerusalem. And at Jerusalem, these offerings and these sacrifices, there's all kinds of different elements to them. And they're supposed to be a time of joy and celebration. And the way of worshiping the Lord is not supposed to be just a solemn, heavy thing, but a joyful time. And there's a lot of feasting that goes into the offering of their tithes and the different vows and all the different things. There's a portion that the people were able to enjoy as well as a kind of meal with the Lord. And so it wasn't just do what you want wherever you want, but come to Jerusalem, be a part of the system, be unified together in the right worship of Yahweh. And while there, you could experience a covenant reaffirmation and renewal every time you come and are working through the different liturgies of the sacrifices and the festivals. And so it was important for the people to come together. And one of the challenges with the idea that everybody can just do as they see fit is it's a lot easier to drift. And I mean, we've all seen this over the last 2 years with COVID. Drifting is easy. It's easy to drift. And so to be intentional with our walk with the Lord, there's like gathering times, being together, all those kinds of things are intended to help people stay connected to worship the Lord. And so even the people of Israel had a tendency to drift. People today have a tendency to drift, but community, being together, can help us worship the Lord rightly. So he's saying wipe out all the other things, the pagan worship systems, come to the central shrine and worship together, and be joyful as you do this. So then, like, if all the sacrificing are happening in one central place, what about all the food that is not being sacrificed, those animals? So the Lord tells them what to do in the next section, verse 15. Nevertheless, you may slaughter your animals in any of your towns and eat as much of the meat as you want, as if it were a gazelle or deer, according to the blessing the Lord your God gives you. Both the ceremonially unclean and the clean may eat it, but you must not eat the blood. Pour it out on the ground like water. You must not eat it in your own towns, the tithe of your grain and new wine and olive oil, or the firstborn of your herds and flocks, or whatever you have vowed to give, or your freewill offering or special gifts. Instead, you are to eat them in the presence of the Lord your God at the place the Lord your God will choose. You, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levites from your towns, and you are to rejoice before the Lord your God in everything you put your hand to. Be careful not to neglect the Levites as long as you live in your land. And so the Lord's saying, come to the central place, do the offerings, but that doesn't mean you have to do all of the slaughtering of animals in the central place. You can do that in your hometowns. So if you have a goat that you're going to prepare for a meal that is not vowed to the Lord, then you can prepare that at home. The key is they cannot consume the blood. They have to pour it all out onto, like, properly drain the blood onto the ground. And there's a couple different reasons for this. Early on, we read in the law that the life is in the blood. And so in pagan worship systems, people might drink the blood as a way to try to get a kind of animalism or animalistic power or something like that. There's also, the recognition, though, that life comes from the Lord. And so to offer that blood in any way other than to God would be a violation of the covenant with the Lord. And so sprinkling it on a different altar would be bad. Drinking it, consuming it would be bad. And so they pour it out onto the ground as if to say, this is just going back to God's creation, back to like it is not being worshipped in any way. The animal's not being worshipped. No pagan idols are being worshipped. It is just going back to what God has made, back to the ground. So pour it out on the ground. And so while they are not offering those animals as sacrifices, there is still a sacredness to the recognition of the value of life, that the life is in the blood. This animal is alive, and they are taking its life to sustain themselves. And so they need to honor God's commands in that way. And then also, as he's talking here, he says, but if you have a tithe, don't eat that at home. If you've set aside a portion for the tithe, don't eat that at home, but take that to the central place. And in that tithe, we also see an indication here that 10% of their offering or their harvest, their flocks, all those different things, that is also there to care for the Levites, because the Levites are not as part of the inheritance system. They do not have their own crops to grow that they could sustain themselves. And so the tithe is to care for the Levites that are scattered throughout the land in all the different villages. And so there's we're going to see a couple times where the Lord will highlight that we need to keep in mind the people who are not able to care for themselves, who are not able to provide for themselves, people who are in financial challenge, or not financial, but material challenges with food and shelter, refugees, those kinds of things. The Lord commands the people of Israel to care for the vulnerable. Let's pick up in verse 20. When the Lord your God has enlarged your territory as he promised you, and you crave meat and say, I would like some meat, then you may eat as much of it as you want. If the place where the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far away from you, you may slaughter animals from the herds and flocks the Lord has given you as I have commanded you. And in your own towns, you may eat as much of them as you want. Eat them as you would gazelle or deer, but the ceremonially unclean and the clean may eat it. But be sure you do not eat blood. Did I read that page already? Nope. Sorry. You must not eat the blood. Pour it on the ground like water. Do not eat it. But take your consecrated things and whatever you have vowed to give to the place the Lord chose. I'm sorry. I feel like no. Okay. All right. There are sometimes you read through the Bible and it's like, this is very repetitive. And this is one of those times. Present the burnt offerings on the altar of the Lord your God, both the meat and the blood. The blood of your sacrifices must be poured beside the altar of the Lord your God, and you may eat the meat. Be careful to obey these regulations I am giving you, so that it may always go well with you and your children after you, because you will be doing what is good and right in the eyes of the Lord your God. And so, if you want to eat an animal at home, you slaughter it properly, pour out the blood. You can eat as much as you want. But anything that is offered as an offering to the Lord, these sacred meals, the blood of those animals need to be poured out on the base of the altar in the central place at the tabernacle, and then later at the temple as it is built. And all of these things are to ensure that the people of Israel are rightly understanding that life is sacred, even animal life, and the blood of the animal that's serving as a sacrifice, that gift of their life for sacrifice is a sacred gift. And so to honor the Lord, to recognize that they are like a substitute, they're paying the penalty for sin, they are buying back the firstborn through their sacrifice, all these different things that the law has talked about needs to be focused in on the Lord in the central place where they assemble. So the next section, or in a little bit, we'll get a little bit of the understanding of what is clean and unclean, what are the things that they can or cannot eat. But when we look at the sacred meals, only people who are ceremonially clean can eat the sacred meals, but anybody can eat the meals at home. And so there's a little bit more clarity for food preparation in Deuteronomy at this point. So let's pick up 29. The Lord your God will cut off before you nations who are about to invade and dispossess. But when you have driven them out and settled in their land, and after they have been destroyed before you, be careful not to be ensnared by inquiring about their gods, saying, how do these nations serve their gods? We will do the same. You must not worship the Lord your God in their ways, because in worshiping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods. And so the Lord is saying, I'm going to give you victory, right? I'm going to go before you. As we read last week, there's going to be nations that are bigger than you, stronger than you. Do not fear them. The Lord will drive them out. And so then he's here is like, now you're settled, don't get comfortable in thinking, well, maybe I'll just figure out what these other people were doing. It seemed to be working for them for a long time. And so I will see how they worship their gods, and I'll do the same thing. And no, the Lord's saying, do not do this. You have to worship the Lord the way he's calling them, is what the covenant here is saying. And part of the reason why the Lord is using Israel to drive these nations out of the land of Canaan is because of their idolatrous practices and the wickedness of what they were doing. And so things like temple prostitution, that was a part of some of these pagan rituals, but here is spelled out, they were offering their sons and daughters as sacrifices. And so this is one of the things that is most abhorrent to the Lord, to see that like these people were offering their children. And it's disgusting and vile in so many, in our own sensibility, and like recognizing how highly God values life, that anybody would do this as a way to try to please some kind of deity, like that is a heavy grief. And so the Lord is reminding them, don't do that. Don't fall in that trap, because it will lead to destruction. And it says, do not be ensnared by inquiring about their gods. Sometimes we might be curious about the ways of the world even now. I'm like, well, let's just see what's going on with this horoscope, or what other kinds of practices that are playing with the spiritual realm. Maybe my friend does tarot readings, or we kind of fiddle around with these different things, and they're a snare, is what the scripture says when we start questioning about things that are spiritual, or worshiping other gods like the people of Israel had to deal with. And we have to be mindful of that so that we don't fall in that trap. And the question is, what are you worshiping? And if we're worshiping the Lord, then we recognize that the idols of this world are empty, as Paul says, but we also recognize that there are spiritual realities that we should be mindful of, trusting that the Lord is greater is he who is in us than he that is in the world. But but we don't want to go and fall into a trap with these different gods, lowercase g. Verse 32. See that you do all I command you. Do not add to it or take away from it. Verse 13:1. If a prophet or one who foretells by dreams appears among you and announces to you a sign or wonder, and if the sign or wonder spoken of takes place, and the prophet says, let us follow other gods you have not known, and let us worship them, you must not listen to the words of that prophet or dreamer. The Lord your God is testing you to find out whether you love him with all your heart, with all your soul. It is the Lord your God you must follow, and him you must revere. Keep his commands and obey him. Serve him and hold fast to him. That prophet or dreamer must be put to death for inciting rebellion against the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. That prophet or dreamer tried to turn you away from the way the Lord your God commanded you to follow. You must purge the evil from among you. So in chapter 12 to 13, there's like, do all the things I've commanded you. And then it shifts to where you might find sources of rebellion. And so the first one is a false prophet. And false prophets are something that the people of Israel wrestled with throughout their history. People would come and claim to speak for the Lord, or they would just lead people away. And one of the most famous instances is with Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And the prophets of Baal were brought in through Ahab's marriage to Jezebel, and Jezebel brought in all of her Baal worship, and Ahab was on board with it all. And so there were all these prophets of Baal that the people of Israel in the northern kingdom were following, and the Lord called Elijah to stand up to the false prophets of Baal. And so you can read about that conflict in the books of Kings. And so the false prophet here, like the Lord, like the text is very blunt here. Like a false prophet might predict something, and that thing might come true. The next question is, what are they asking you to do? Like if they say, look at this, they predict like a drought, and they say, look, the drought's here. And now, because I was able to predict the drought, we should go and follow Baal. That is not a good prophet. And so don't just look for the signs, but also listen to what they say. What are they calling you to? And the best way to be able to determine if there's a false prophet is to know the truth, to have an understanding of God's word in your life. And so for the people of Israel, understanding the covenant, understanding the terms of the covenant, understanding God's commands and law, all of those things are there to protect them from following after one of these false prophets. And so this is an important piece. And, if they try to pull you away from the Lord, then to reject them. Remember what God has done in rescuing the people from slavery in Egypt. But then he also says you must purge the evil from the land. And so there is a capital punishment to the false prophet, anybody who tries to pull you away from the Lord, which is intense. And it's not necessarily something that, we don't, I don't know anybody who's like, yeah, let's go kill false prophets. Like, that's not really a great message that people resonate with. But for the people, the Lord is calling them to take their relationship seriously. And so the false prophet is an outsider who's or somebody maybe in the like an individual in the people of Israel who is rising up to call people to false gods. But that's not the only source of rebellion, because verse 6 tells us, if your very own brother or your son or daughter or the wife you love or your closest friend secretly entices you, saying, let us go and worship other gods that neither you nor your ancestors have known, gods of the peoples around you, whether near or far, from one end of the land to the other, do not yield to them or listen to them. Show them no pity. Do not spare them or shield them. You must certainly put them to death. Your hand must be the first in putting them to death, and then the hands of all the people. Stone them to death, because they tried to turn you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Then all Israel will hear and be afraid, and no one among you will do such an evil thing again. And so here Moses is saying, look, yeah, it's easy to say, well, that false prophet, that guy's crazy. He's not one of us. He's out there. He's doing his own thing. Eliminate him. But what if your brother comes to you and says, we should worship Asherah? And the Lord is being, confronting that and being very serious here. Like, if even a family member comes to you and tries to pull you away from following the Lord, you have to take this seriously. You have to eliminate them. And one of the interesting things here with the capital punishment of stoning people, it says your hand should be the first and the other people's hand should be involved. You must stone them. With stoning, they would take the group of people would come to take the person, and all these people with stones would be throwing them. And so it wasn't one person responsible for the execution, it was the community. And so there was a weightiness to it, that everybody was called to a responsibility to obey the Lord. And allowing people to pull people away was a responsibility, a brokenness in the community. And so the community was being called to respond appropriately to eliminating the threat to the community. And so it's intense to think about. Like, it's not ideal. And what the intention here is that let's not let this get to this point. Obey the Lord. Obey the Lord, and you don't have to practice this. If you don't turn away from the ways of God and follow after false gods, then you don't have to stone people. And so that is more the intention here, is you don't want to do this. We don't want to make you do this, but this is what you're called to do if this happens. And so, well, sadly, we don't really ever see this ever happening. But we do see a lot of false prophets throughout the history of the people of Israel. And so while we don't see people practicing the stoning this way, we see ignoring the commands of God. And this is part of the heartbreak of the Old Testament. And so let's keep going. Verse 12. If you hear it said about one of the towns as the Lord your God is giving you to live in, that troublemakers have risen among you and have led the people of their town astray, saying, let us go and worship other gods, gods you have not known, then you must inquire, probe, and investigate it thoroughly. And if it is true, and it has been proved that this detestable thing has been done among you, you must certainly put to the sword all who live in that town. You must destroy it completely, both its people and its livestock. You are to gather all the plunder of the town into the middle of the public square and completely burn the town and its plunder as a whole burnt offering to the Lord your God. That town is to remain a ruin forever, never to be rebuilt, and none of the condemned things are to be found in your hands. Then the Lord will turn from his fierce anger, will show you mercy, and will have compassion on you. He will increase your numbers as he promised on oath to your ancestors, because you obeyed the Lord your God by keeping all his commands that I am giving you today and doing what is right in his eyes. And so it's gone from one person, a false prophet, to a household, your family. It's gotten closer, and then to a whole town. If a whole town is turning from the Lord and following false gods, the Lord says, investigate that, find out what is true, what is actually happening. And if you find that they are actually doing this, then they're called to destroy the town, to eliminate the people, and to not take any of the things from the town. It's all contaminated because of the false worship, because of their idolatry. The town is impure, and so they must destroy all of it. And so this is what we're going to see when they go to Jericho, and the Lord says, destroy the town and don't keep anything for yourselves. It's that same kind of principle. Like, the town is corrupt, the town is contaminated, so everything in it is contaminated with idolatry. Do not keep it. And so that's part of what the Lord is calling at this point. Now, capital punishment is not something that people want to do, and it's not something that they should want to do. And so, like, the Lord is putting this all out there as Moses is speaking, like, this is what is required if this happens, but it doesn't have to get there. It doesn't have to get there. And so the hope is that people would trust the Lord. And we're going to see later on in Deuteronomy the list of curses and blessings for the blessings for obeying and the curses for disobeying. And the curses for disobeying are intense, and they're heartbreaking. And disobeying the Lord is something that people take on themselves. It is not something that has to happen in the covenant, but people continually reject the Lord and his commands throughout the scriptures. So talking about the harsh reality of disobedience and the consequences of false prophets and following the gods of the nations around them would lead to mourning. And that leads to chapter 14, the opening verses of chapter 14. You are the children of the Lord. not the children of the false gods, the Lord your God. Do not cut yourselves or shave the front of your heads for the dead, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. Out of all the peoples on the face of the earth, the Lord has chosen you to be his treasured possession. So this is one of those, one of the passages that like we recognize the contrast between the people of Israel and the people of the nations around them is cutting themselves or shaving parts of their head for the dead, like as a part of pagan mourning. And this is one of the areas where tattooing may be a part of the practice, where people would tattoo themselves as a way of worshiping the dead. Now, we just talked about like towns that are disobeying the Lord, and if you had to be a part of destroying a town of your own countrymen, that would be sad. I don't think there's any doubt that that would be overwhelming. But the Lord now is saying, like, they fell into the trap of pagan worship, and cutting yourself for the dead, shaving off parts of your head for the dead, like that is part of pagan worship. Don't fall into it. Don't. You are God's, and so remain like God's possession. Not, you are God's possession. So you need to watch yourself so that you don't fall into the rituals of the world around you, mourning like those who have no hope. And part of this as well is remembering that the people of Israel are intended to be a kingdom of priests. They are called to stand out among the other nations so that they could show what covenant faithfulness looks like and the blessings that are a part of covenant faithfulness to the nations. And so all of the ways, even the ways that they mourn, need to be distinct from the nations around them. And so the false gods, worshiping idols, mourning for the dead like the pagan neighbors of the people of Israel, all of these things are things that pollute, they contaminate. This is what sin does. As we read through the Old Testament, it contaminates relationship and makes people unclean. And so the Lord will continue to talk about other things, clean and unclean. So we've talked about how to sacrifice in the central place, how to honor the Lord as you handle the blood of animals you eat at home. And then we talked about false prophets and false idolatry and all these different things. And so in verse 14, then we're going to look again at what are detestable and what are clean things, as in this first part of chapter 14. So starting verse 3. Do not eat any detestable thing. These are the animals you may eat: the ox, the sheep, the goat, the deer, the gazelle, the roe deer. Sorry, something keeps popping up on my computer. The roe deer, the wild goat, the ibex, and the antelope, and the mountain sheep. You may eat any animal that has a divided hoof and chews the cud. However, of those that chew the cud or have a divided hoof, you may not eat the camel, the rabbit, or the hyrax. Although they chew the cud, they do not have a divided hoof. They are ceremonially unclean for you. The pig is also unclean. Although it has a divided hoof, it does not chew the cud. You are not to eat their meat or touch their carcasses. Of all the creatures living in the water, you may eat any that has fins and scales, but anything that does not have fins and scales, you may not eat. For you, it is unclean. You may eat any clean bird, but you may not eat the eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the red kite, the black kite, any kind of falcon, any kind of raven, the horned owl, the screech owl, the gull, or any kind of hawk, the little owl, the great owl, the white owl, the desert owl, all the owls. Don't eat owls. The osprey, the cormorant, the stork, any kind of heron, the hoopoe, and the bat. All flying insects are unclean to you. Do not eat them. But any winged creature that is clean, you may eat. Do not eat anything you find already dead. You may give it to the foreigner residing in your towns, and you may eat it, and they may eat it, or you may sell it to any foreigner. But you are a people holy to the Lord your God. Do not cook a young goat in his mother's milk. All right, so this list of prohibited animals is an important piece of the law. There are clean and unclean animals. And there are all kinds of people with all kinds of theories about why these animals end up in the group of clean or unclean. The simplest one is split hoof, chew the cud, clean. If they don't do both of those, they are unclean. And so that's part of the list here. Another piece that is something to that maybe playing in mind, in particular with pigs, is pigs were often associated with pagan worship, and so there's no if an animal is not fit to be offered at the altar to the Lord, then it's not fit to be offered to consume for human sustenance. And so the clean and unclean list here again is it good enough for God? if God doesn't want it, you shouldn't want it either, is one way to look at it. And so some of these may have been not just pigs, but some of these other ones may also have been part of the pagan worship around them. And so it's like, don't offer these things. Others elements here, some of these animals are eating dead things, like the raptor birds that will eat carrion flesh, things that are found dead. They'll eat the scavenger birds, those kinds of things. So don't eat those. So these different categories don't have a really strong rationale, other than they may be just not clean animals with what they consume. They may be offered to pagan idols in the neighboring countries, but then also they may seem to be a kind of mix or hybrid of things. So like the bat. The bat is a mammal. It doesn't have feathers, but it flies. And so it is in between two worlds, is what it kind of feels like. And so the bat is in some kind of hybrid. It is impure. It is not consistent with being a bird or a mammal. And so it is unclean. But then also there are bats that do suck blood. And so blood is something that the Lord takes very seriously. And so the Lord, it may be tied to that as well. Now, I don't know for sure if vampire bats in particular are in this part of the world, but there may be something about that in the known regions there. So but yeah, this list of birds is a lot of birds. Most of these are going to be carrion type birds that should not be eaten. And then also talks about like how to handle animals that are already found dead. And in a country, in a region where sustenance may be at times hard to find, and it would seem illogical to waste animal meat. But for the people of Israel, they must properly drain the blood out of an animal. And so like an animal that is found dead, they couldn't have drained the blood. So that's one of the reasons why they can't eat it. But it doesn't mean that they would just waste it. And so the Lord gives them the allowance to give it to a foreigner, somebody who's not part of the covenant community with Israel, with the Lord, or even sell it to them. They could do that, but they cannot eat it. Part of the risk, if they were to try to sell it, is moving it, because that could make them unclean. So they would probably have to say to their neighbor, like, hey, I found one of my ox died overnight. Do you want it? If you want it, you can come and take it. And so they would probably coordinate to have it moved that way. And then the last law there, don't boil a goat in its mother's milk. And was also in Exodus 23:19. And so the most common explanation for that is it's part of a Canaanite festival ritual that was just thoroughly detestable to the Lord, and somehow connected to fertility of some sort. But yeah, it is one of the things that is just declared to be not appropriate for the people of Israel. And so verse 22 makes a shift then to how the people are called to offer their tithes in the coming years. Verse 22, be sure to set aside a tenth of all that your fields produce each year. Eat the tithe of your grain, new wine, and olive oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks in the presence of the Lord your God at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. But if that place is too distant and you have been blessed by the Lord your God and cannot carry your tithe, because the place where the Lord will choose to put his name is so far away, then exchange your tithe for silver and take the silver with you and go to the place the Lord your God will choose. Use the silver to buy whatever you like, cattle, sheep, wine, or other fermented drink, or anything you wish. Then you and your household shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice. And do not neglect the Levites living in your towns, for they have no allotment or inheritance of their own. At the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of the year's produce and store it in your towns, so that the Levites who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied, and so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. All right, so every year the people were to bring the tenth of their produce of what their land made and their flocks to the temple, the central place, and there to have a feast. And there were portions of the tithe that the people were supposed to eat there as a part of the celebration, and so that was a way of like essentially entering into a host meal with the Lord. And the key is not that the people are hosting the Lord, rather they're recognizing that the Lord provided all these things and he is hosting them. And so they are coming and eating with the Lord, who does not eat, but it's a symbolic meal. And so they would burn things on the altar as a part of the offering to the Lord. And then the Levites would also serve and in these roles, and so they would be given a portion to eat in these meals. What was left over would be saved for the Levites and the priests to provide for them throughout the year, because they, as has been said, they do not have land to produce their own crops. They may have been stewarding flocks, as we looked at in Leviticus. They may, in Numbers, they may have been stewarding flocks, but they would not have the same tracts of land to care for large flocks like the rest of the people of Israel. And so they, so they needed to be cared for and provided for with the people through the tithes. Then the Lord also gives this great little blessing here, saying, like, let's say you had just a really great year, and traveling with 10% of all of those things would be too hard. And the God says you can sell it and convert it to money and take that money and buy it at the temple, and then do the offerings, the tithes, and all the things that you're supposed to do at the temple. And this is an important thing when we look to the future, because when Jesus comes and he goes to the temple and he sees the money changers there, he is recognizing that the people were following these commands, but it had become corrupted. And so they started to take advantage of the pilgrims who were coming to the temple to worship the Lord through exchange rates, and making it difficult for them to worship him without being ripped off, essentially. And so, yes, the Lord gives them this allowance to convert their tithes to money, to then buy the tithes in Jerusalem that they can use in the temple. So it is a good allowance, but people corrupted it over time. And so that was part of part of God's design to help it make it easier for people. But then also we see this other part of the law here is every 3 years they were supposed to make sure that they brought all of that year's produce and store it in their own towns. And so every 3 years, their towns would have a warehouse of sorts to provide for the Levites, the fatherless, the widow, the poor, and the foreigner among them. These are the quartet of the vulnerable and the Levites, people who needed a hand. And so even here, the Lord is creating what some may call a social safety net for the people in their community to make sure that nobody was suffering among them. And as we follow through the rest of Deuteronomy, part of God's promise to them is if they are obedient, then they will see God's blessing in so many different ways, and they will be able to provide for people. There will be more than enough. And then go all the way to Malachi 3, where the Lord is challenging the people towards the end of the Old Testament. This is after the exile. They've come back and they're trying to build the temple, but they get distracted and they're like, well, I got to build my own house and take care of myself. And the Lord says, you're robbing me. He's talking about bringing the whole tithe into the storehouse. This is what he's talking about, this passage here, like bring it all, because the storehouse was meant to care for the people, and caring for the people would help make sure that there were that they were following in the obedience of the Lord and his commands, and they would know that they were experiencing the blessings because they were being obedient, so they could continue to care for the people around them who were vulnerable. And so this provision for others is a key part in the Old Testament law. It's a key part in the early church when the followers of Jesus were coming together in the book of Acts. There were people who were less fortunate among them, and so they started selling their land and selling their stuff to take care of one another. And so generosity is intended to be something that flows out of the relationship with God and honoring him with their whole lives. But then also that generosity is meant to bless the people we are in relationship with, whether it's somebody who's close to us or somebody who we don't really know, maybe somebody from a different culture. But the relationship is there are brothers and sisters, there are neighbors, there are people who are made in the image of God. And so we must learn to care for them. And so this tithing principle, roll it back to Genesis and Melchizedek, where Genesis gives a tithe to Melchizedek, the priest of Salem. But even here, the Lord is saying, bring your tithe as a way to bless the vulnerable among you, to take care of the Levites, to honor and worship the Lord. And so these are all parts of the ways that the people can ensure that they are following the covenant well. And we will continue next week. We'll talk more about some of the worship regulations that the Lord has laid out for the people in the covenant. But yeah, so we'll stop there, and we'll not next week, but in 2 weeks we'll be back to talk more about Deuteronomy. So any questions or thoughts in this in these 3 chapters?
What Bible translation are you reading from?
I am reading from the NIV.
NIV, okay. Because I think I have something slightly different. So next time I'm gonna grab that one because it would make it easier to read along.
Okay. Well, if you do you have a copy of the NIV?
I think I do. Somebody gave me an ESV, so that's what I've got.
Yeah, the ESV is a fine translation.
Yes.
But yeah, they make some choices with their translations that makes it a little harder for me to wholeheartedly endorse. So
yeah, I really like the version you're reading from, so I prefer
so
that.
this, if you come on Sunday, this is the version that we have in the chair Bibles. So if
Okay.
you don't have an NIV, just take
Okay.
one. We have
Okay.
plenty. So
Thank you.
it's not as high quality of like paper and stuff, so it might be a little harder to read sometimes, but it's free. You can have it if you don't already have an NIV. And in particular, if you have an NIV at home, I'm using the 2011 update, and so it's the one before that was 1984.
Wow.
And so there's not a lot of major changes, but there are going to be some times where like a little word tweak to be a little bit more clear with contemporary English. But yeah, the NIV is great. I love the NIV. So yeah, any other thoughts or questions?
I got a thought
Okay.
on here. When it talks about all flying insects that swarm are unclean to you, do not eat them.
Uh-huh.
As well, if you go future forward, that John ate the locusts.
Yes, locusts are actually one of the clean insects.
So they wouldn't be under that category of flying insects.
Yeah. So there are it does get spelled out a little bit more in Leviticus about the insects. So sorry, I'm looking for the reference. It was in my notes somewhere. I think Leviticus 18, or possibly Leviticus 11 talks about the snakes and stuff. Yeah. So yeah, but locusts were allowed. So yeah. There's something about their
grasshoppers,
What's that?
They do sell chocolate covered grasshoppers,
I know, and I've had a chocolate covered grasshopper. It was not good. Yeah.
It's an oyster sauce.
Yeah, we had a game when I was in youth group that was basically eat weird things. So that's what I did. Yeah, so chocolate covered grasshoppers was part of that. Christy, were you saying something about Cambodia?
Yeah, my husband had a Cambodian coworker, and we went to dinner at their house, and they had crickets that were fried in oyster sauce, and they were delicious.
Okay.
Yeah, I was very brave, but my family growing up, my mom, like, her spice shelf is salt and pepper and ranch dressing. And so when I met my husband, my husband's father is Chinese, and we went to dim sum, and he plopped a chicken foot on my plate and looked at me. And he hadn't said a word to me the whole time. And so I was like, well, how do you eat this? And he told me, and I tried it. And he was like, so tell me about yourself. Like, that was his test to see if I was going to be, a good girlfriend to his son. So
that's one way.
Yeah. It's kind of a difficult road in with him, but apparently one of Dove's ex-girlfriends was vegan, so the chicken feet weren't going to fly.
That's funny. Yeah. When we read the New Testament, the food laws get opened up for Gentiles. Like, we don't have, like, that's one of the beautiful things about following Jesus is we can have bacon. So when we read these food laws, like, I would still advise you not to eat crows, not to eat bats, all that stuff. But it is all not. All those animals are not part of our requirements as Gentiles. So, huzzah!
That was really confusing to me as a kid trying to read the Bible on my own. I was like, wait, am I supposed to do everything in the Old Testament? So
yeah. So part of the key when we read Old Testament law is, as a follower of Jesus, we read the law and we look to the heart of the law that Jesus is calling us to. And so, like, if we are working to follow the 10 commandments as followers of Jesus, aces. Like, that is really good. That's a great standard, because that's a universal command. Those are universal commands. But when we get to, like, ceremonial laws, a lot of what the food laws are about are ceremonial commands. And for Gentiles who are not a part of the Jewish faith or the Hebrew covenant, following the ceremonial laws is not required, because that's not part of our cultural identity as non-Jews. So yeah. Which is cool but you can, if you go through the law and you're like, this is a good law. I want to, like, you read even the food laws, like there are good things in the food laws. Like bats are not good for you. I think
Right.
we can all agree. Bats, not a great scene after the last 2 years. Like, come on. So, yeah. Anyway, I'll stop. Any other thoughts or questions?
Would we be better to follow those food laws and things? Wondered because Christ came, of course, to free us, but things were in the very can't even talk. We're in the very beginning. Wouldn't they still have some kind of importance? Let's say like pork. Now, I like pork, but I kind of hesitate to even eat it knowing the rules behind it.
Yeah. So it wouldn't hurt you if that is a personal conviction. Like if you have the personal conviction to not eat pork,
Right.
then that's fine for you.
Right.
But when we read the New Testament, part of so it's Acts 10, Peter sees the vision of the animals coming down on the fabric. And the Lord says to him in this vision, get up, Peter, kill and eat. And Peter's like, I've never touched an unclean animal. And Jesus is saying, nothing, if I tell you to do this, it's okay. Like I'm making all things clean. And then, Cornelius's envoy comes and says, hey, here's a bunch of Gentiles. We'd love to know more about Jesus. And so there's this connection between Jesus saying, I am making things clean, and here's some unclean people who want to hear about Jesus. Look at what Jesus is up to. He's making things clean through the gospel.
Okay.
So we, as we continue through Acts, we see the people are kind of like freaked out. Like, Peter, why are you hanging out with Gentile people? This is not okay. And Peter then recommunicates, like, this is what happened. And then Paul and the mission and Barnabas, they go to start these churches in Gentile counties and countries, and Jewish people come along behind them and say, all these Gentiles, they're not getting circumcised. They're not following our laws. What are we doing? And so that's what leads to the Acts Council in chapter 15, where they talk about like what is required of Gentiles. And so what's required are don't worship any other god, don't consume blood, and don't practice sexual morality. And all of those are tied to worship in the pagan world. And so, like, if Gentiles can just do those things, then they don't need to be circumcised. They just need to make sure that they're rightly worshiping God in Christ. So it's a shift of focus for Gentiles, but the goal is still worshiping God. But they don't have to be Jewish to worship Jesus. So that's same for us. We don't have to be Jewish to worship Jesus.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, doesn't the circumcision become in your heart at that point? Not an outward thing. I mean, doesn't Paul say that? It's not an outward thing, it's an inward thing. You're circumcised in your heart.
Yeah. So even in a couple weeks ago in Deuteronomy, the Lord said, circumcise your hearts. So that was not a unique idea that Paul had. It was in the Old Testament. It was in the scripture. And Paul is even then like calling them back to say, like, if you are only concerned with the marks of the flesh, then you are missing the point. God is calling us to circumcise our hearts. And so if a Gentile person has a circumcised heart, then the flesh is not what matters. Yeah. And that's Paul's argument in Galatians, is where he talks about that. So but Paul goes even further. He's like, if you're so concerned about the marks of the flesh, then, and you want to be serious about your circumcision, then just cut the whole thing off. It's what Paul's getting at. Yeah. So Paul's not messing around.
No.
So it's like, yeah. I love Paul. Like there are moments where it's like Paul has had enough.
Yeah.
So I was like, cut it off.
I have to
So.
say his militant background comes bombing out at that point in time.
Yeah, he's definitely got some passion. So zeal for the Lord is what we would call it. So yeah. Any other thoughts or questions from this passage?
One more, the silver into tithes, you sold the flock, you got your silver and played that into tithes. And then, so you went to the temple and you rebought animals. Is that correct?
Yeah.
To sacrifice?
Yep.
So that's what started up the whole temple sales. And then Jesus gets extremely mad that they've corrupted it.
Yes. That is it. And so by the time that Jesus comes, the Jewish people are spread throughout the Mediterranean too. So like traveling with any animals long distances would have been almost impossible. So almost everybody coming was probably making those exchanges in the temple because it was just so cumbersome to try to bring all their animals. So it was kind of like going downtown and having to pay parking. Like everybody's got to pay parking. And the parking people know this. And so sometimes they charge you very little, but sometimes they'll charge you like $75 for 3 hours, right?
Yeah.
And like they have the spots, like they've got it, like I don't. And so like that's kind of where they're at. Like the people are coming to try to worship the Lord, and it's like they have the lambs. I don't have a lamb. I'm paying whatever they tell me. And so yeah, and so that made it, instead of being a time to be joyful and worshiping the Lord at the festival, it became something that they had to do begrudgingly. It's like, oh, they have the lambs. So and so Jesus is correcting that because it was just breaking people. So yeah.
Quick thought on that one. How come they didn't, as you came into the town, because that would make the temple area so dirty and so, I mean, animals bleating everywhere and, pooping everywhere and making messes. That would make that area so nasty. It's like, no, do that outside. When you come into the city, do your exchanges there, keep the temple clean and orderly. End of story. Do it that way.
Well, I don't know why they didn't do it that way. I don't know. I can't answer that question. It makes sense. But the temple was kind of gross anyway, because they were killing a lot of animals in there.
Oh, true.
Just keep it in mind. Like there was a lot of blood, a lot of gross stuff happening. So like one of the things, like when growing up, like our church did not allow beverages or food in the sanctuary. We wanted to keep it clean. Right. And the first time I went to a church that allowed coffee in the sanctuary, I saw somebody come in. I was like, they're going to make a mess in here. and they didn't. They were responsible adults, and they figured out how to not spill their coffee. But it was one of those like things where we tend to try to keep things clean and pristine based on our standards. Like we want God to have like a good housekeeping magazine, and we want our church to be on the cover, right? But the temple was a lot of activity, and it was not as clean as we thought it maybe would, what we would like. So Tony's gone. All right, he's left the chat. Good to see you, Tony. If you're watching later, bye. Yeah, but all right, any other thoughts, questions?
No.
All right. Well, y'all, so next week I am going to be in Roatan, and so I won't be able to do this. So we will be off next week, and then I'll be available the day before Thanksgiving too. If you're available, I'll be here. So I'll be here or either at home, because we're going to do neighborhood table, and they don't have youth groups, so I might go home, but I'll still be available to do group. So sound
You're
good?
going to Roatan?
I am going to Roatan. Yes.
I wanted to go so bad. I'm so excited for you guys.
Well, Lizzie, we'll go again.
Okay,
So-
I'm going next time.
All right. So I'm hoping this week is the first time we've gone in November. So I'm hoping that this will be a good experience. We used to go in March, but it was very expensive in March. So
What's
I'm
the
hoping-
weather like this time of year?
mixed. The weather right now says rain and thunderstorms next week. So I'm hoping that's just like at nighttime. So we'll see.
You'll find out.
Yeah, we will. I'll bring a coat. So, all right. Well, I'll see y'all later. Have a good night.
And you too.
Blessings to you, Pastor Jason.
Bye.